There's a very specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from work. It doesn't come from lack of sleep. And it doesn't always happen after something dramatic. Sometimes it happens after spending a few hours with a certain person. You leave the conversation feeling strangely heavy, mentally foggy, emotionally tense, like something inside you has been quietly drained without you fully understanding why. And what makes this confusing is that the person may not seem obviously harmful. They might even seem normal, friendly, interesting. Sometimes they're people you care about deeply, but your nervous system reacts to them differently. You feel alert around them, careful around them, responsible around them.
And by the time you're alone again, your energy feels gone. Not physically, psychologically. Now, most people explain this feeling very simply. They say, some people are just toxic. But the psychology behind this experience is usually much deeper than that. Because feeling drained around certain people is not only about who they are, it's also about what your mind unconsciously starts doing in their presence. And once you understand that, a lot of your relationships begin to make more sense. Because emotional exhaustion is rarely random. Your nervous system pays attention to patterns long before your conscious mind does. It notices unpredictability, tension, emotional inconsistency, the feeling that you need to monitor yourself carefully around someone. And even if you don't consciously recognize it, your body does. That's why some conversations feel effortless, while others feel emotionally expensive. One interaction leaves you calm. The other leaves you overstimulated without knowing why. And often, the difference comes down to emotional safety. Psychologically, humans relax around people who feel emotionally predictable. People whose reactions feel stable, clear, safe to exist around. But when someone feels emotionally unpredictable, your brain quietly shifts into a different mode, observation mode. You start monitoring tone, facial expressions, energy changes, small emotional reactions. You become hyper-aware of how they might respond to what you say. And that constant monitoring consumes energy, a lot of it. Especially if you learned early in life that paying attention to other people's emotions was necessary. Maybe you grew up around someone emotionally reactive, a parent whose mood changed suddenly, a household where tension could appear without warning, an environment where staying emotionally aware helped you avoid conflict. And without realizing it, your nervous system adapted. You became good at reading people. Very good. You learned how to notice shifts in emotion quickly. You learned how to keep the peace, how to adjust yourself, how to avoid triggering reactions. And while that ability may have helped you survive emotionally, it also created something exhausting: hypervigilance, the constant scanning of emotional environments. This is why certain people drain you more than others. Not always because they're bad people, but because your nervous system doesn't feel fully safe relaxing around them. So instead of simply being present, part of your mind stays alert, managing, predicting, preparing. And that internal effort becomes exhausting over time, especially in relationships where emotional clarity is missing. Because uncertainty forces the brain to keep searching for answers. You start wondering, are they upset? Did I say something wrong? Why does their energy suddenly feel different? And even if nothing is technically happening, your nervous system still reacts. Because ambiguity itself can feel emotionally unsafe to certain people, particularly people who grew up around inconsistency. Now, here's where this becomes even more psychological. Sometimes the people who drain you are not emotionally loud. Sometimes they're emotionally unavailable. And emotional unavailability creates a very specific kind of exhaustion, because the brain keeps trying to emotionally reach someone who remains psychologically distant. You start over-explaining yourself, trying harder,
Giving more energy, more understanding, more emotional effort, hoping eventually the connection will feel mutual. But when emotional reciprocity never fully arrives, the interaction slowly becomes one-sided. And one-sided emotional labor is deeply draining. This is why some people feel exhausted after relationships where technically nothing bad happened. No major fights, no obvious toxicity. Just a quiet feeling of carrying the emotional weight alone. And over time, that creates emotional depletion. Because relationships are supposed to regulate your nervous system, not constantly dysregulate it. Healthy connection usually creates calm, not chronic emotional tension. But many people confuse emotional intensity with emotional connection. That's important, because unpredictability can sometimes feel familiar, especially to people who grew up earning emotional safety instead of naturally receiving it.
So the nervous system starts associating emotional inconsistency with attachment, and calm relationships begin to feel unfamiliar, even boring, while emotionally complicated people feel strangely magnetic, not because they're healthier, but because the nervous system recognizes the pattern, and familiarity often feels safer than peace, even when it hurts. This is why emotionally draining relationships can become addictive in a strange way. The brain keeps searching for resolution, for clarity, for emotional certainty. And every small moment of validation feels disproportionately relieving, like finally getting emotional oxygen after holding your breath. But eventually, the cycle catches up with you. You begin feeling tired before conversations even happen. You overthink interactions afterward. You need isolation to emotionally recover. And slowly, you stop feeling like yourself around certain people. That's one of the biggest signs. Not simply feeling tired, but feeling emotionally disconnected from your natural self. Because psychologically safe relationships usually allow you to become more yourself, not less. You don't constantly monitor your words. You don't feel pressure to emotionally perform. You don't leave every interaction analyzing what happened. You simply exist. And your nervous system relaxes because it no longer feels responsible for maintaining emotional stability all the time. Now, this doesn't mean every draining person is intentionally harmful. Some people are carrying unresolved emotional chaos themselves. Some people communicate through tension because that's what feels normal to them. Some people unintentionally create emotional confusion because they've never learned emotional consistency. But understanding someone's behavior does not make its impact disappear. That's important. You can empathize with someone and still recognize that your nervous system feels exhausted around them. And many emotionally aware people struggle with this because they confuse empathy with responsibility. They think, if I understand why they act this way, I should tolerate it. But psychological understanding should create clarity, not self-abandonment. And eventually, you reach a point where your body starts telling you what your mind keeps trying to rationalize. You feel tension before seeing their name appear on your phone. You feel relief when plans get canceled. You feel emotionally lighter after distance. And those reactions matter, because your nervous system is constantly collecting information about what feels emotionally safe and what doesn't. Now, here's the deeper part most people avoid confronting. Sometimes the reason certain people drain you so much is because they activate an old version of you. The version that learned love through emotional management. The version that had to earn connection by staying emotionally useful. The version that became hyper-aware of other people's needs while disconnecting from their own. And around certain personalities, that survival pattern quietly turns back on. You stop resting emotionally. You start adapting again, monitoring again, overgiving again. And eventually, you feel exhausted not just by the person, but by who you become around them. That realization changes things. Because now the question is no longer, why are they like this? The question becomes, why does my nervous system stop feeling safe around them? And that question leads somewhere much more honest. Because healing is not just learning how to avoid emotionally draining people. It's learning how to recognize when your body is asking for emotional safety instead of emotional survival. And once you learn the difference, your relationships begin to change. You stop chasing emotional intensity. You stop mistaking anxiety for connection. You stop over-functioning emotionally just to keep relationships stable. And slowly, you begin choosing people who feel calmer, clearer,
Safer. Not because they're perfect, but because your nervous system no longer feels exhausted trying to exist around them. And that kind of peace changes you. Quietly, but completely.